Ella, a woman in her late 30s, once passionate about rescuing animals, now leads a quiet, isolated life. After the death of her beloved dog, Max, Ella has distanced herself from the shelter work she once loved, still haunted by the grief. When her old friend Maya, who runs a local shelter, asks her to help bury a recently deceased dog, Ella reluctantly agrees. Despite her reservations, she feels an unexpected tug to return to the place that once gave her purpose, unaware that this moment will bring her face to face with her deepest emotional struggles. Ella stepped out of the car, her feet sinking into the dirt with each step. The cemetery felt empty, almost abandoned, as though the world itself had forgotten this place. Rows of gravestones stretched out before her, standing like silent witnesses. She hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest. The heaviness in the air seemed to weigh her down. Maya, already unloading the small coffin from the trunk, didn't seem to notice Ella's hesitation. Her movements were efficient, but there was a quiet urgency to them. "Let's get this over with," she said, her voice steady and firm. Ella swallowed hard and nodded, forcing herself to follow. The air felt thick around her, as though every breath was weighed down by an unseen burden. She wanted to say something, to break the silence, but nothing felt right. They walked together, but the space between them seemed wide, the quiet too deep. "Do you think we should have, chosen somewhere else?" Ella asked, her voice quieter than usual. Maya didn't look up as she carried the coffin. "The shelter doesn't have the space. This is the best we can do." Her tone softened just slightly. "Max wouldn't want us wasting time." Ella nodded, though the discomfort in her chest didn't ease. She followed Maya to the burial site, but the heaviness in the air remained. The silence felt suffocating, and she couldn't shake the sense that something was off. As they began digging, the earth seemed to resist their efforts, as if unwilling to yield. Ella's shovel scraped against the ground, the sound unnaturally loud in the silence. Each movement felt deliberate, but it was like she wasn't fully present. Her hands trembled, her thoughts far away, lost in memories of things she'd rather forget. She glanced over at Maya, who was digging with steady precision. Maya didn't seem to notice the weight of the silence, the way it felt like it was closing in on them. And then, the first bark echoed through the air. Ella froze, her heart leaping into her throat. She looked around, expecting to see a dog nearby, but there was nothing. "What was that?" she whispered, her voice tight with confusion. Maya didn't stop digging. "Probably just a dog nearby," she said, her tone casual. Ella nodded, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The barking had been so sudden, so sharp. She glanced around, but the cemetery remained eerily empty. The barking came again, louder this time, persistent, echoing across the quiet cemetery. Ella's breath caught in her chest. There was no dog, no person, just the barking. "Maya, do you hear that?" Ella asked, her voice trembling. "Where's it coming from?" Maya paused for a moment, her eyes scanning the empty cemetery. She didn't seem as alarmed, but there was a subtle unease in the way she moved now. "I don't know," she said, the urgency creeping into her voice. "Let's just finish this quickly." Ella's heart raced. The barking grew louder, and though it didn't make sense, she felt as though the sound was following them. Each bark seemed to echo her own unease, her own fears. She tried to push the thought away. "Maybe we should leave," she whispered, her hands trembling on the shovel. Maya shook her head, a firm expression on her face. "No, we finish this. We don't have time for hesitation." Ella opened her mouth to protest but stopped. She didn't want to argue, not now. But the barking, how could it be real? How could it be happening? As the barking continued, Ella's thoughts drifted back to Max, the dog she had failed to save, the one she tried to forget, but whose memory lingered like a shadow in her mind. She hadn't dealt with his death, hadn't allowed herself to mourn. And now, with each bark, the grief she had buried deep inside her threatened to rise to the surface. The barking seemed to mirror her own inner turmoil, pulling at something deep within her. Her grip on the shovel tightened, but it didn't stop the shaking in her hands. The sound of the barking, it was like a cruel reminder. Max's face flashed in her mind, the way he had trusted her, the way he had looked at her in those final moments. She couldn't save him. She hadn't been enough. The tears threatened to come, but she bit her lip, trying to hold them back. Not here, not now. She couldn't let Maya see how weak she was. The barking grew louder, a constant pressure on her mind. Ella's thoughts became jumbled. She couldn't focus. The pain she'd buried deep inside her seemed to swell with every bark. She thought she was past it, thought she was moving forward. But this wasn't just a random noise. It was something else. "Why am I even here?" Ella whispered, her voice breaking. She didn't have an answer. The guilt gnawed at her, pulling at her heart. She had left the shelter, left the animals. She had abandoned her work, abandoned Max. How could she ever forgive herself for that? Maya's voice broke through her thoughts. "Ella, we need to finish. Please." Ella didn't respond immediately. The struggle inside her was too much. But she knew Maya was right. They had to finish. "I'll keep going," Ella whispered. But her voice was shaky. Maya's tone had changed. She sounded more worried now. "Ella, we can't keep standing around. Something's wrong here." Ella looked at Maya. She was right. But Ella wasn't sure if she could push through the storm of emotions inside her. "Maya, I can't do this," Ella admitted softly. Maya stepped closer, her face full of concern. "You can. We're almost done. Just finish this and then we can go." Ella hesitated, her hands still trembling. The barking echoed in her ears, louder than before. But Maya was right. They couldn't stay. Not now. The barking suddenly stopped, leaving a tense silence in its wake. The air felt heavier, thicker now, as if the world was holding its breath. Ella paused, feeling the weight of everything pressing down on her. The unresolved grief, the guilt, the fear. The silence was almost worse than the barking. But she couldn't stop now. She couldn't keep running from the past. Ella forced herself to take another step forward, her hands still shaking, but determined. The reckoning was coming, she could feel it, and she couldn't avoid it any longer. The shovel sliced into the damp earth with a dull thud, sending small clumps of soil scattering across the mound. The cemetery was eerily quiet except for the occasional whistle of the wind through the barren trees. Ella and Maya worked in near silence, their faces pale and strained under the weak glow of the moonlight. As they carefully lowered the lifeless body of Max into the grave, the first bark shattered the stillness. It was faint, distant, and indistinct, but enough to make Ella pause. She gripped the shovel tighter, her breath catching in her throat. "Did you hear that?" Ella asked, her voice trembling. Maya glanced up, frowning. "Hear what?" Another bark, this time louder, sharper, as if the sound was crawling out from the very ground beneath their feet. "There it is again," Ella whispered, her wide eyes scanning the surrounding darkness. "It's barking, but it sounds like it's coming from here." Maya shook her head, her nerves beginning to fray. "That's impossible, Ella. It's just your imagination. Let's finish this and go." But the barking didn't stop. It grew louder, more insistent, each echoing yelp piercing through Ella's resolve like shards of glass. Her pulse quickened, a cold sweat forming at the nape of her neck. "Max is gone," she murmured to herself, trying to steady her breathing. It's just in my head." Maya threw another shovelful of dirt onto the grave, her hands trembling now. "Ella, stop overthinking this. Let's just finish and leave. Please." But the sound was unmistakable now. A deep, guttural barking that seemed impossibly close, closer than before. Ella's hands trembled as she tightened her grip on the shovel. She looked at the grave, her heart pounding in her chest. And then it happened. The coffin shifted. Ella froze. She couldn't trust her eyes, but the movement was undeniable. The wooden box jerked ever so slightly, as if something or someone inside was struggling to get out. "Did you see that?" Ella gasped, her voice barely a whisper. Maya's face paled, her mouth falling open. No, this can't be happening." A scratching noise followed, faint at first, then frantic. It was a desperate sound, like nails clawing against wood. The barking grew louder, now mingled with what sounded like whimpering. Ella staggered back, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "It's alive," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Max is alive." "That's not Max," Maya shouted, panic spilling into her voice. "It can't be. He was gone, Ella. We both saw him." But Ella couldn't take her eyes off the grave. Her mind raced with memories of Max. His playful barks, his wagging tail, the way he'd nudge her hand for attention. Now those memories were tangled with the horrifying reality before her. "Ella, don't do it," Maya pleaded, seeing the conflict etched across her friend's face. "We don't know what's in there. Please don't open it." Ella hesitated. Fear and grief clashed in her chest. her heart aching with the weight of what she was about to do. But the thought of walking away, of leaving without knowing the truth, was unbearable. With trembling hands, she knelt by the grave, her fingers brushing against the coffin's lid. The scratching stopped, replaced by a low, mournful whine that sent a shiver down her spine. "Help me," Ella said, her voice barely above a whisper. Maya shook her head, stepping back. I can't do this. Please," Ella begged, her eyes glistening with tears. "I need to know." Reluctantly, Maya moved closer, her hands shaking as they joined Ella's on the lid. With one final, unspoken agreement, they pried it open. The sight inside froze them both. There lay a dog, alive but barely. Its fur was matted with blood, its body battered and bruised. Its eyes, wide with pain and confusion, locked onto Ella's. The barking stopped, replaced by a pitiful whimper that broke her heart. "That's not Max," Maya said, her voice shaking as she stumbled back. "Ella, that's not him." But Ella couldn't look away. She felt a connection to the creature, something unexplainable and primal. Her tears spilled over as she reached out, her hand hovering just above the dog's trembling body. What is this?" she murmured, her voice cracking. "How is this even possible?" Maya didn't answer. She was too stunned, too horrified by what she was seeing. The dog's appearance was unnatural, almost otherworldly, as if it didn't belong in this world or any world. For a long moment, the two women sat in silence, their minds racing with unanswered questions. The barking had stopped, leaving an oppressive stillness in its place. Ella felt a deep, unrelenting grief swell in her chest, the weight of Max's loss colliding with the surreal reality before her. She didn't know whether to feel fear, sympathy, or something else entirely. The injured dog let out another whimper, its pain evident in every sound it made. And as Ella stared into its eyes, she realized one thing with chilling certainty. Their night was far from over. The air felt heavier as Ella stared at the dog lying before her, its fragile frame trembling slightly with each shallow breath. What little light there was seemed to reflect off the strange scars and markings that covered its body, like cryptic etchings carved into its flesh. The shapes weren't random. They were deliberate, almost ritualistic, and they filled Ella with a deep sense of unease. Her stomach twisted as her mind raced to make sense of what she was seeing. "This isn't normal," she muttered, her voice barely audible over the pounding in her chest. Maya took a step closer, her expression a mixture of shock and fear. "Ella, look at its side," she whispered, pointing to a particularly jagged mark etched into the dog's ribcage. It resembled a symbol, a crude, unsettling design that stirred something deep within Ella, but she couldn't focus on it for long. The sight of the dog's injuries was too much. Each gash, bruise, and unnatural scar seemed to mirror wounds she carried within herself, wounds she'd buried deep and tried to ignore. A lump formed in her throat as memories of Max flooded her mind. She could see him so clearly now. His wagging tail, his trusting eyes, the way he'd always been there for her even when she hadn't been there for herself. "I can't," Ella choked out, taking a step back. Her grip on the shovel tightened as her knees threatened to buckle. "It's too much. This is too much." Maya placed a hand on her shoulder, grounding her as Ella began to spiral. "Ella, breathe," Maya said gently but firmly. "I know this is hard, but we can't leave it like this. This dog needs us." Ella shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "Do you think I don't know that? Do you think I don't see how much pain it's in? But what am I supposed to do, Maya? What if I'm not strong enough?" Maya's gaze softened. "Ella, it's not about being strong. It's about doing what's right, even when it hurts. You can't keep running from this pain. Max wouldn't want you to." At the mention of Max, Ella's sobs deepened, but Maya's words pierced through the haze of grief clouding her mind. Slowly, Ella sank to her knees beside the dog. Her hands trembled as she reached out, gently brushing its matted fur. The dog flinched slightly but didn't pull away. As her fingers traced the lines of its scars, her eyes locked onto the symbol etched into its side. Something about it felt familiar, tugging at the edges of her memory. And then, like a floodgate bursting open, a memory surged forward. She saw herself years ago, sitting at her desk late at night, surrounded by case files and photographs. It was from her time investigating animal cruelty cases, a time she had tried desperately to forget. The symbol had been there, connected to a series of underground operations she had exposed. She thought she'd left it all behind, but now it was here, staring back at her, etched into the skin of this suffering animal. Her breath caught in her throat as realization dawned. This wasn't just a coincidence. This dog wasn't here by chance. It was connected to her past, to the very case she had walked away from when the pressure became too much. This symbol, she whispered, her voice trembling. I've seen it before. Maya knelt beside her, her brows furrowed. What do you mean? Ella swallowed hard, her mind racing. It's tied to a case I worked on years ago. There were animals. So many of them, marked like this. I thought I shut it all down, but maybe I was wrong. Maybe it never really ended. Maya placed a steadying hand on Ella's arm. Then maybe this is your chance to finish what you started, she said softly. You can't change the past, Ella, but you can choose what you do now. This dog needs you, and maybe, just maybe, you need it too. Ella's eyes filled with tears as she looked at the dog again. Despite its battered state, its eyes held a spark of life, a desperate will to survive. It was a reflection of her own struggle, her own pain. And in that moment, she made a decision. No more running, she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. I'm not leaving this unfinished. Not again. Maya nodded, a small smile breaking through her fear. Together, they gently lifted the dog, cradling its fragile body as they prepared to take it to safety. The weight of the animal in Ella's arms was both physical and symbolic, a reminder of the burden she'd carried for so long and the responsibility she now chose to face. As they moved, the barking that had once echoed through the cemetery ceased, leaving an eerie stillness in its wake. But Ella didn't feel afraid anymore. For the first time in years, she felt a flicker of hope. The dog's presence wasn't just a coincidence. It was a message, a turning point, and Ella was ready to confront whatever came next. She had spent too long letting her grief define her. But now, holding this fragile life in her arms, she realized something important. Healing wasn't about forgetting the pain. It was about finding purpose in it. With renewed determination, she looked to Maya and said, "We're going to fix this. For the dog, for Max, and for me." And for the first time in what felt like forever, Ella believed her own words. Ella sat on the floor of her living room, the dog lying on a soft blanket in front of her. Its breathing was shallow, its body still trembling slightly. She had spent hours cleaning its wounds, carefully applying ointment to the deep cuts and covering them with gauze. The strange scars and marks on its fur still unsettled her. But now, as the dog whimpered softly, she felt a fierce determination take root. This wasn't just about saving the animal, it was about saving herself. For a moment, she hesitated. The thought of taking full responsibility for the dog overwhelmed her. What if she failed? What if it didn't survive? The weight of the what-ifs pressed down on her chest. But then she looked into the dog's eyes. Deep, dark, and full of pain, and something shifted. She couldn't walk away. Not this time. "I don't know if I can do this," she whispered, her voice trembling. But even as the words left her lips, she reached out, her hand resting gently on the dog's head. "But I'll try. For both of us." Over the next few days, Ella threw herself into caring for the dog. She set alarms to remind herself of feeding times and medication schedules. Each task became a small victory. The first time the dog drank water from her hand, the first tentative steps it took toward her. Slowly, its condition began to improve. As she watched the dog heal, Ella couldn't help but notice the parallels to her own life. Its wounds, though physical, mirrored the emotional scars she carried. The way it flinched at sudden movements reminded her of the way she had flinched at memories of Max. Every time the dog winced or whimpered, she felt a pang of guilt for the times she had tried to suppress her own pain. One evening, as she sat by the dog, stroking its fur, a tear slipped down her cheek. "You're stronger than me," she murmured. "You've been through so much, and you're still fighting. I don't know if I could do that." But as the days turned into weeks, she realized she was fighting, too. Each time she cared for the dog, she confronted her own grief. And each time the dog responded with a wag of its tail or a quiet nuzzle, it felt like a tiny piece of her heart was healing. The dog's resilience became a symbol for Ella. It had endured unimaginable pain but still found the strength to trust her. Watching it grow stronger reminded her that forgiveness, of others and herself, was possible. One evening, as the dog rested its head on her lap, she found herself speaking aloud, as if to the universe. "I'm sorry, Max," she said, her voice breaking. "I'm sorry I didn't protect you. I'm sorry I ran away from the shelter. From everything. I thought if I ignored it all, it would stop hurting. But it didn't." The dog stirred, looking up at her with those deep, soulful eyes, as if it understood. Ella smiled through her tears. "You're teaching me how to forgive. You're teaching me how to start over." Caring for the dog reignited something in Ella, a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. Memories of her time at the shelter came flooding back. The joy of seeing a scared animal find a forever home, the satisfaction of knowing she had made a difference. She realized she missed it, missed feeling like she was part of something bigger than herself. One morning, as she cleaned the dog's bandages, she spoke to Maya over the phone. "I've been thinking about going back to the shelter," she said hesitantly. "Not full-time, but maybe volunteering. I think I'm ready." Maya's voice was warm and encouraging. "Ella, that's amazing. You have such a gift for helping animals. They need you, just as much as you need them." Ella looked at the dog, now sitting up and wagging its tail slightly. "Yeah," she said softly. "I think we're both ready for a second chance." A week later, Ella stood outside the shelter, the dog by her side. Her heart pounded as she stared at the familiar building. Memories of her time here, both good and bad, rushed back. She had avoided this place for so long, convinced it held nothing but pain for her. But now, with the dog's leash in her hand and a newfound sense of resolve in her heart, she felt different. As she walked through the doors, the staff greeted her warmly. Some recognized her immediately, their faces lighting up with surprise and joy. Others were new, unaware of her past here. But none of that mattered. What mattered was that she was here, ready to face the memories and create new ones. The dog, now healthier and more confident, wagged its tail as it sniffed around the shelter. Ella felt a sense of pride watching it. This dog, once so broken, was now a symbol of resilience and hope, not just for itself, but for her, too. That evening, Ella sat in her living room, the dog curled up beside her. She thought about how far they had both come. The pain of losing Max was still there, but it no longer consumed her. Instead, it had become a part of her story, a chapter she could look back on with both sadness and gratitude. She reached down, stroking the dog's soft fur. "You saved me as much as I saved you," she said quietly. "Maybe even more." The dog opened its eyes, looking up at her with a gentle expression that felt almost human. Ella smiled, a deep sense of peace washing over her. For the first time in years, she felt like she could breathe again. This wasn't the end of her journey. There would still be challenges, still be moments of doubt and sadness. But now she knew she could face them. With the dog by her side, she felt ready to embrace whatever came next. As the dog let out a soft bark, Ella laughed. "All right, I get it," she said, standing up. "Time for dinner." And as she moved through her home, the dog following close behind, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Discover the power of second chances and the healing bond between humans and animals. Follow Ella's inspiring journey of love, forgiveness, and hope. Don't miss this heartfelt story. Like, comment, and subscribe for more uplifting tales that touch your soul. Share to spread the message of compassion and resilience today.